Hello and welcome to Radio EastMed. I am your host, Editor-in-Chief Ertan Karpazli, bringing you the top stories and roundups of the month of August 2020. In August, the United Arab Emirates shocked the world by suddenly announcing plans to normalize relations with Israel. The announcement was quickly followed up by talks to establish an Emirati embassy in Israel, albeit in Tel Aviv as opposed to Jerusalem. The deal also came within the context of US President Donald Trump's peace plan for the Middle East, spearheaded by his advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner. Naturally, the deal came with some strings attached. One of those strings was Israel's suspension of plans to annex large swathes of Israeli-occupied territory in the Palestinian West Bank. Authorities in Abu Dhabi portrayed this as a success for the Muslim and Arab world, which has been watching Israeli moves closely since Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went forward with his pre-election promise to officially incorporate illegal Jewish settlements all the way up to the Jordan Valley into the Jewish state. In return, Israeli tech companies are poised to receive big investments from the UAE. However, the Israeli government has reiterated that the suspension of annexation plans does not amount to the cancellation of them. It has also dismissed rumors that the deal includes the sale of US-made F-35 fighter jets to the UAE, which apparently created some confusion in Abu Dhabi, leading to the cancellation of an important meeting for the normalization of ties. This has left many wondering what the UAE actually has to gain from the deal. Nonetheless, the deal was held by a handful of Muslim countries, namely Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Oman, and Bahrain, even though none of these countries themselves have diplomatic relations with Israel. Many have speculated that these countries may be next to normalize ties with the Jewish state. Saudi Arabia and Bahrain particularly have an interest in supporting Israel as a counter to Iranian expansion efforts towards the Mediterranean. Despite being inclined to support their Arab brethren in the struggle for Palestinian sovereignty, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain are more concerned about Iran spreading its Shia influence across the region, even to the Sunni Muslim Palestinians. Sudan, meanwhile, under the former regime of ousted leader Omar al-Bashir, was a sworn enemy of the Jewish state, and was placed on a US list of state sponsors of terrorism. However, since Bashir's ouster, the new military council leading Sudan through its political transition has made efforts to comply more with American international interest and get itself removed from that list. One way of doing this has been to show a warming of ties with Israel. Earlier this year, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu flew to Uganda to meet with Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the head of Sudan's Sovereignty Council. Oman, being one of the countries to extend its congratulations, is also pipped to follow the UAE, which was only the third Arab country to officially establish ties with Israel after Egypt and Jordan. While Egypt and Jordan agreed to recognize Israel after suffering defeats at the hands of the Israeli military, the UAE was the first Arab nation to establish diplomatic ties based on mutual interest alone. Other Arab nations that have not been at war with Israel have thus far abstained from doing this, mostly because they have worried about how it would affect their standing, first and foremost with their own people, and secondly with Arabs and Muslims in general. The UAE has not had to be too concerned about that, as the vast majority of its population is comprised of foreign workers who have no say in state matters. Oman is quite similar in that sense, and it is also known for being rather independent and keeping out of the affairs of its neighbors. Therefore, it does not face the same internal pressure as other Arab countries. On the other end of the Arab world is Morocco, which, owing to its distance from the Middle East, is also not involved in the region's conflicts. Although Morocco has ruled out normalization with Israel, the existence of unofficial ties are difficult to deny. Beyond the Arab world, Malaysia and Indonesia are two Muslim-majority countries that could also be lined up for normalization. Just like Morocco, their distance from the Middle East means they are not directly affected by the problems between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Until now, such countries have largely abstained from establishing ties with Israel as a symbolic show of solidarity with the Palestinians, But from a purely secular and materialistic point of view, this gesture has presented little to no benefit for these countries. Instead, such posturing has only denied them the opportunity to have better relations with the US, which is still undoubtedly the most powerful country in the world. It has been 72 years since the State of Israel was established. Since 1948, the Muslim world, for the most part, has stood beside the Palestinians. Even Egypt and Jordan, despite recognizing Israel, have frequently used their positions to amplify the Palestinian voice. But in recent years, the Muslim world has grown somewhat impatient with the Palestinians, who are still dogged by infighting between its two main political factions, Fatah and Hamas. Their inability to coordinate between themselves and unite in the name of the Palestinian struggle has understandably left many Muslim nations frustrated. The lack of popular resistance coming from Palestinians against Israel leaves many Muslim countries, who are suffering economically due to their solidarity with them, wondering whether their sacrifices have been worth it. Many Palestinians themselves actually recognize Israel by taking up its citizenship, while others profit off the construction jobs created by the building of illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Even Palestinian groups that do resist Israel are a huge question mark for other Arab states in the Middle East. While Hamas is closely linked with the Muslim Brotherhood movement, which enjoys much support from Turkey, the Islamic Jihad group is heavily backed by Iran. It may be that countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Jordan would prefer to deal with Israel rather than see Turkey or Iran spread their influence to Jerusalem. When it comes to Saudi Arabia and its Arab Gulf allies UAE, Bahrain and Kuwait, their reasons for opposing Turkish and Iranian moves in the region goes beyond geopolitical. There is also a religious element. The leaders of these Arab countries largely subscribe to the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, particularly its Madkhali Salafi branch. According to their ideology, the 12 Shias of Iran are considered to be heretics. The Madkhali Salafis are also at odds with the Muslim Brotherhood over an important matter of Islamic creed. Madkhali Salafis believe in three components of Tawheed, or the oneness of God, which is at the core of the Islamic religion. These components are Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, which is the oneness of God's divinity, Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, the worship of one God, and Asma wa Sifat, the names and attributes of God. In accordance to this belief, anyone who believes in or worships another God, or anyone who denies God's attributes or ascribes those attributes to others, cannot be a Muslim. While all Orthodox Muslims are agreed on these three components, some Muslims add a fourth category called Tawheed al-Hakimiyyah, which is oneness of God's rule. This states that any leader who rules according to a law other than God's law is not a believer. This basically provides Muslims with a mandate to remove any leader who implements a legal system that contradicts the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. This fourth category is found at the root of all Muslim Brotherhood affiliated movements, including the Turkish National Vision movement, from which Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan emerged. The Madkhali Salafis see this as dangerous, as it opens the door for takfir, or the declaring of Muslims as disbelievers. Many Arab monarchists and secularists particularly fear this ideology, especially considering their not-so-Islamic lifestyles. They fear it could lead to rebellions against their rule, and ultimately their demise. It is therefore not in their interest to see either of these ideologies become dominant in the region. In the absence of a reliable Madkhali Salafi or secular Arab nationalist partner among the Palestinians, they'd prefer to see Israeli Zionism reign supreme. The Trump administration is aware of these divisions in the Muslim world, and therefore they sent Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on a tour of the Middle East, which included stops in Sudan, Bahrain and Oman, to push for normalization with Israel. Yet despite his efforts, there was still a general reluctance to follow in the UAE's footsteps. Even Saudi Arabia insisted that it will not normalize ties with Israel until a peace deal is achieved with the Palestinians. Riyadh's attitude may have come as a surprise to Abu Dhabi. The foreign policies of both countries have been inseparable as of late. This has been witnessed in the wars in Syria and Yemen, in the fight against ISIS in Iraq, in their joint support for President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, in their siding with renegade commander Khalifa Haftar in Libya, and in their isolation of Qatar over its backing of the Muslim Brotherhood. However, since Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman became implicated in the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul in 2018, Riyadh has found it increasingly difficult to get the international community to cooperate with it. This has presented Abu Dhabi with the opportunity to step up and fill in where Riyadh would have usually taken the lead. Perhaps by recognizing Israel, the UAE thought its Arab counterparts would immediately follow suit, and thus establish itself as the leading pioneer of the Arabian Peninsula. But by refusing to do the same, Saudi Arabia has reminded its ally, the UAE, who the real boss is. Although one cannot rule out Saudi Arabia jumping on board eventually, it is possible that Riyadh is simply biding its time to observe the Muslim world's reactions to the Israeli-Emirati approach. Despite Saudi Arabia's track record of pursuing policies that are generally unpopular amongst most Muslims around the world, its reluctance to recognize Israel shows that Riyadh still acknowledges its status as a Muslim country and the importance it holds as the custodian of the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina. No doubt, if Saudi Arabia recognized Israel, it would also open the door to other Arab states such as Bahrain, Kuwait and Oman to do the same. But if doing so later proved to be a massive miscalculation of foreign policy, the backlash would be catastrophic for the ruling elites of these countries. So, it appears that the UAE will be alone in its recognition of Israel, at least for now, as other Arab Gulf states are not yet willing to take such a risk. The UAE also shouldn't expect Israel to do it any favors to that end. It certainly hasn't helped Abu Dhabi's image that its deal with Israel was announced while Israeli airstrikes continued to pound the densely populated Palestinian Gaza Strip for days, in retaliation for what Israel says were cross-border balloon attacks by Hamas. Funnily enough, it may have been the UAE's arch-rival Qatar that helped Abu Dhabi save face, having stepped in to encourage Hamas to stop attacks on Israeli territory so as to bring an end to Israeli airstrikes. The de-escalation also followed a visit by a Hamas delegation to Turkey. Although Turkey, under a previous government before President Erdogan's time, recognized Israel, for the past decade Turkey's relations with Israel have been poor. Erdogan's government has instead had superb relations with Hamas, which in spite of its lack of support from Saudi Arabia and its allies, and its being internationally blacklisted as a terrorist organization, is still considered by the majority of the Muslim world to be a legitimate resistance force against Israeli aggression. Turkey's hosting of the Hamas delegation, about a week after the UAE announced its normalization of ties with Israel, sent an important message to the Muslim world. The visit portrayed a picture of sincerity on Turkey's behalf, not only to the Palestinian cause, but also to the Islamic cause in general. The UAE, meanwhile, may have got a wink and a nod of approval from the US Trump administration, but it lost much prestige in the eyes of Muslims worldwide. If first assessments are anything to go by, without any promises on the transfer of F-35s, with no guarantees that Israel won't annex the West Bank, and the lack of any solid backing for its decision to normalize ties, the UAE has already lost much more than it has gained. Throughout the 1990s, the Mediterranean was often referred to as a NATO lake. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, the region largely became a geopolitical playground for the West and its allies. Soviet attempts to reach warm waters by creating corridors of influence in Southeast Europe had failed, and the advance of the biggest rival to Western hegemony in the Mediterranean was pushed back to its starting point. There was, however, one remnant of the Soviet Union in the region that was inherited by Russia, the successor to the USSR. That remnant was the Russian naval base in Tartus, Syria. For decades, the security of this naval base was entrusted to the Assad family. The base ensured a permanent location in the Mediterranean where Russian Navy vessels could make a pit stop and repair damages that would occur during long voyages. Without the base, Russia had no secure way of venturing very far beyond the waters around its Black Sea naval base in Sevastopol, Crimea. And just as the base in Syria gave Russia the confidence to sail its ships as far as the Atlantic through the Straits of Gibraltar, its presence also made the West fearful of a Russian resurgence that would see Europe come under a Russian naval siege. Under President Vladimir Putin, Russia has proved that Europe is justified in reserving such fears. By intervening in the Syrian civil conflict to gain victory for its ally Bashar al-Assad against anti-regime forces, Russia saved its Tartus space from falling into the hands of powers that could potentially threaten it. Not only that, but Russia was also able to expand its presence in Syria, which now hosts a Russian military airbase in Latakia. This has strengthened Russia's hand in the region, and this has been evident in reports that Moscow deployed Russian fighter jets from the Latakia airbase to bolster its ally in Libya, renegade commander Khalifa Haftar. With Russian mercenaries already found in Haftar's ranks, victory for his forces would potentially leave southern European countries located directly opposite Libya, namely Malta and Italy, exposed to an ever-growing Russian threat. Nonetheless, by presenting itself as the only viable alternative to Turkey's growing influence in Libya, Russia has succeeded in dividing European opinion, even amongst NATO allies. Malta, Italy, and the US have seemingly shown more leniency towards Turkey's initiatives in Libya, while Greece, Cyprus, and France have shown more of an inclination to support the same side as Russia in the conflict over the side backed by their NATO ally. Russia has particularly taken advantage of simmering tensions between Turkey and Greece over energy exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean to creep into the region, seeking the possibility of another springboard of soft power by which it can challenge NATO's dominance there. Yet, there is one factor that the Russians appear to have overlooked when making their calculations: the possibility of a rapprochement between Athens and Ankara. Yes, tensions between the two neighbors have arguably been at their highest as of late, especially as both nations issued rival Navtex alerts in the same areas of the Mediterranean on the same dates throughout the month of August. These tensions have been exacerbated by the arrival of fighter jets from the United Arab Emirates to the Suda Bay naval base in Crete, as well as the deployment of Greek, French, and Italian aircraft for military exercises to the Andreas Papandreou airbase in Paphos, Cyprus. Footage was even released of Turkish F-16 fighter jets warding off Greek warplanes over the Mediterranean in an area where Turkey was holding its own drills, as they attempted to fly to Cyprus from Crete. However, while such incidents point to an all-time peak in tensions, developments off the battlefield indicate that Turkey and Greece are actually heading towards a de-escalation. The first sign of goodwill came earlier in August when Greece and Egypt made a maritime demarcation agreement to recognize one another's claimed exclusive economic zones for hydrocarbon exploration. The deal between Athens and Cairo set out to override a previous agreement between Ankara and the UN-recognized Libyan Government of National Accord in Tripoli, which saw swathes of maritime territory claimed by Greece southeast of Crete divided between Libya and Turkey. That agreement was based on Turkey's understanding of international law, which Ankara says does not grant nations the right to establish EEZs around small islands. Greece, meanwhile, bases its claim on the understanding that small islands can be used when establishing EEZs, which grants it the right to claim the vast majority of the Aegean and lock Turkey into the Bay of Iskenderun via its easternmost island of Castellarizo, located just 2 kilometers south of Turkey's coastal Antalya province. Yet, when agreeing terms with Cairo, Athens left Castellarizo out of the equation. The Cairo-Athens agreement left Egypt with the option of one day possibly linking its EEZ with that of Turkey, and even challenge a previous agreement between Greece and Cyprus. Many have considered this a flirtation between Turkey and Egypt, but also a wink from Greece to Turkey that it is willing to talk. Following some German mediation efforts, Greece has said that it is ready to de-escalate tensions with Turkey, while Turkey has said it is happy to engage in negotiations with Greece without preconditions. The softening of tone comes as both sides gradually become acquainted with the limits of how many liberties they can take with one another. Greece has learned the limits of its diplomatic offensive against Turkey's resolve to use its military to defend its interests in the Mediterranean, having failed to push the EU into implementing sanctions against Turkey at a meeting of foreign ministers in Berlin on August the 28th. Meanwhile, Turkey is also coming to understand that it cannot fulfill its objectives through military prowess alone. The approval of the Egyptian parliament to deploy troops into Libya amid an advance of Turkish-backed government forces on the oil-rich city of Sirte served as a reminder to Turkey that it doesn't have a free rein in the region, while mass protests in Tripoli against the GNA reminded the Turks that their allies lacked the political stability necessary for them to support Ankara's military adventurism. So, it is likely that Turkey and Greece will resort to calming the harsh rhetoric they've been using lately, and figure out a way they can both continue cooperating as Western allies. The arrival of American warship USS Herschel Woody Williams in Crete in late August could possibly be interpreted as Washington finally telling Greece and Turkey that enough is enough and it's time to end their petty bickering. Reports are also indicating that the US may cut off financial assistance to Ethiopia over the construction of a mega dam on the Nile that threatens Egypt's water supply. If true, this might be a sign that the US has coerced Egypt into playing a more stabilizing role between Turkey and Greece, hence the question mark over Castellarizo in Cairo's maritime deal with Athens. It may also suggest that Egypt's intervention in Libya, instead of complementing Russia's backing of Khalifa Haftar, could actually become a way to eclipse Russian influence over Libya's parallel eastern-based government. Egypt could assert itself over Aguila Saleh, the head of the Tobruk-based parliament, whose political will for a ceasefire and talks with the GNA would render Haftar and his Russian mercenaries obsolete. And while Russia struggles to remain relevant to the Libyan battlefield, it is finding it increasingly difficult to implement its strategy in Syria as well. Somewhat of a proxy conflict is emerging between Russia and Iran over who gets to hold more sway over the Assad regime. In recent months, there have been a string of assassinations targeting pro-regime militia leaders with close ties to Russia. Indeed, the US Caesar Act sanctions that target the Assad regime and its affiliates, which came into effect over the summer, has tightened the noose around Assad's neck. This has narrowed the economic playing field surrounding Assad and thus increased the stakes among his allies, leading to pre-existing rivalries in his ranks growing fiercer by the day. Holding on to Syria is a matter of survival for both Russia and Iran, and whereas there was enough room for both Moscow and Tehran to operate side by side before the sanctions, the world is no longer big enough for the both of them. Consequently, Russia's frustrations are beginning to show elsewhere. Its recent airstrikes in the so-called de-escalation zone of Idlib on Syrian opposition forces was a demonstration of anger towards Ankara's failure to keep its side of the bargain by clearing formerly Al-Qaeda-affiliated Hayat Tahrir al-Sham militants from the M4 highway on the Idlib-Latakia border. Instead of fighting with HTS directly, Turkey seems to be pressuring HTS to clear groups like Huras ad-Din, Al-Qaeda's main affiliate in Syria, from the region. In response to Russia's attack, Turkey sent 6 armoured convoys into Idlib, perhaps as a signal to Moscow that it is not willing to capitulate to intimidation tactics. Unlike in February, when a Russian airstrike killed dozens of Turkish soldiers and sent President Recep Tayyip Erdogan immediately to Putin's doorstep to reaffirm the ceasefire, this time Ankara knows that Moscow is on the back foot in Syria, and that the latter's aggression no longer comes from a place of strength, but from a place of weakness. Even in Turkey itself, Russia's hand is weakening. One thing Russia has had going for it in Turkey, as in Europe, was its dominance over the gas imports. But as a result of the global quest to diversify imports and other developments in the market, Russia's monopoly over this arena is starting to break down. While Turkey's overall gas imports are decreasing, Low gas prices and the increasing competitiveness of liquefied natural gas paints a bleak picture for Moscow. Furthermore, Azerbaijan has replaced Russia as the number one exporter of gas to Turkey, and Turkey's recent discovery of 320 billion cubic meters of natural gas in the uncontested Black Sea, which it says points to an even greater untapped resource, suggests that Ankara is now in the position to start working towards closing its account deficit for imports on the road to becoming self-sufficient. The find will also attract the likes of SOCAR, Azerbaijan's national energy firm, which may try to link Turkey's Black Sea deposits with the Trans-Anatolian Gas Pipeline project, otherwise known as TANAP. The project will fit into plans to create a southern corridor of gas supplies from Central Asia to Europe, in which Turkey will be the centerpiece. It also rivals Russia's network of pipelines in Eastern Europe. Russia can therefore only watch on with concern as Baku and Ankara increase their cooperation, especially amid reports that Azerbaijan is considering to grant Turkey a military base in its Nakhchivan enclave, perhaps as a move to counter Russian attempts to sabotage TANAP through attacks on the Tovuz region via its ally Armenia. One can never really predict what Putin's Russia will do, but many in Moscow consider Russia's presence in the Mediterranean as absolutely vital to its survival. Despite being the biggest country in the world, its lack of warm water ports renders it dependent on keeping good relations with its powerful neighbors to secure any kind of access to the lucrative sea trade routes that crisscross the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. Without the ability to deploy its navy vessels to ensure the safe passage of its cargo ships through the Suez Canal and the Straits of Gibraltar, Russian sea trade will always be exposed and vulnerable. Dependence on other nations to provide that security could amount to giving concessions that would ultimately lead to Russia's collapse. Therefore, policy makers in Moscow may be justified in wanting to defend the Tartus space at all costs. There is no limit to what they might decide if they feel that Russia is in a life or death situation. The most obvious answer to the question of what Russia might do is declare an all-out war on Turkey. But with so many fronts to fight on in the region's multi-layered conflicts, Moscow would probably struggle to find the necessary allies to volunteer as its proxies. To declare war at this stage also runs the risk of strengthening NATO's bonds with Ankara. Another option for Russia could be to contribute to the destabilization of the region without getting involved itself, particularly between Greece and Turkey. This strategy would serve to divide NATO and keep the area in endless conflict so as to prevent any rival structure to its power rising up. However, one would like to believe that Greece has more sense than to go to war with Turkey without the help of powerful backers like France and the US. No sensible nation would fall for such a plot, especially while Turkey is strong and united. Armenia, on the other hand, may be coerced into launching more attacks on Azerbaijan, but unless Moscow itself is willing to come to Yerevan's aid when such behavior irks joint military reactions from Baku and Ankara, the end result certainly won't be in Armenia's favor. Such stirring in the South Caucasus could also be met with similar stirring north of the Caucasus Mountains, particularly in Russia's oil-rich Muslim-majority Federal Republic of Chechnya, where Turkey holds a considerable amount of influence. Should Russia give up on its ambitions in the Mediterranean and accept defeat, it could shift its focus to alternative routes to the open seas. The Baltics and Scandinavia in northern Europe could become a new flashpoint for tensions, while Moscow might be tempted to create a conflict in the Caspian Sea with the aim of hitting the proposed southern gas corridor from Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. Nonetheless, Russia is not going down without a fight. Shocking footage of a huge explosion in the heart of Beirut was broadcast around the world on August the 4th. The blast, which was felt and heard as far as Cyprus, killed almost 200 people and injured thousands more. It also left around 300,000 people in the Lebanese capital homeless, as widespread damage was reported across the city. As details began to emerge about the incident, which left a huge smoldering crater in the middle of the city's port, protesters gathered on the rubble of destroyed neighborhoods to protest against government negligence. Too ashamed to put up any resistance,
Prime Minister Hassan Diab's entire government resigned just months after replacing the former government of Saad Hariri. This left Lebanon with no functioning government at a time when the country is trying to negotiate a bailout from the International Monetary Fund to help deal with its worst economic crisis since the Civil War. That crisis has been compounded with the ongoing coronavirus pandemic as well as the US Caesar Act sanctions targeting neighboring Syria. This situation has also raised sectarian tensions within Lebanon, with many pointing the blame for the economic crisis and stagnation in IMF bailout talks on the Iran-backed Shia militant group Hezbollah. As a condition to secure a bailout, the IMF is requesting that Lebanon cracks down on smuggling along its border with Syria. The problem is that the border is controlled by Hezbollah, which profits from the smuggling of subsidized goods between the two countries. This, however, denies the Lebanese state of billions of dollars of income through taxes. Many have warned that if Lebanon does not crack down on this smuggling, the state risks total collapse. Hezbollah has thus far shown no signs it is willing to let go of its control of the border, and has been accused of prioritizing its own needs over that of the Lebanese people. While giving lip service to the bailout talks, Hezbollah has instead indicated it is more concerned about Iran's agenda in the region to bolster its Shia allies. Even though many Lebanese in general, regardless of which ethnic or religious demographic they represent, have grown tired of the country's sectarian quota system, which they say is mired in corruption that is turning Lebanon into a failed state, the power balance that has been in place since the Civil War is so delicate that no one dares to be the first to attempt to overturn it. So fragile is the situation that even Saad Hariri, the son of Lebanon's slain Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, kept relatively silent when a Lebanese court absolved the Hezbollah leadership of any involvement in his father's assassination. Lebanon's Maronite Christian president, Michael Aoun, also moved to quickly dismiss claims that the Beirut port blast was caused by ammonium nitrate that was being stockpiled there by Hezbollah for the purpose of making explosives. How Lebanon's political elites have dealt with the explosion paints a rather embarrassing portrait of reality on the ground in the country. Despite reports that Aoun was aware of the potentially explosive substance being located at the port weeks before the blast, he, much like everyone else in Lebanon, has refrained from admitting any kind of responsibility. And besides a few port workers who appear to have been made scapegoats, there is even more reluctance to blame the explosion on any other third party. There is some speculation that Israel was responsible for the blast. The way the fire preceding the blast broke out resembles a number of Israeli cyber attacks on facilities in Iran that have caused fires. Some have also suggested that the storage unit containing the ammonium nitrate may have been hit by some kind of missile. Israeli drones have committed a number of violations of Lebanese airspace as of late. Nonetheless, Israel has not claimed responsibility for the blast. If it did, such an attack would almost certainly be interpreted as a declaration of war, which Israel would most likely prefer to avoid at this present time. Even so, Israel knows that Lebanon is even less eager for a war than they are. Assuming that Israel was behind the blast and Lebanon knew it, the Israelis know that Lebanon would never publicize the incident as an attack. Such an admission would ultimately pressure Lebanon into entering a war it is not ready to fight. Meanwhile, the people of Beirut continue to pick up the pieces of their broken homes as pledges of aid come in from abroad. The situation is truly a demonstration of the Lebanese state's inability to look after its own people, as they are now left to the mercy of foreign powers. This is where the real danger comes in for Lebanon. The state's weakness is proving to be an invitation for other states to move in and carve up this strip of land along the Mediterranean coast. Lebanon is already an extremely polarized country, with Sunnis, Shias, Maronites and Druze all deeply divided into their own little cantons. It has for a long time been a sitting duck for foreign powers such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel and Syria, all of whom exploit the situation in Lebanon to push for their own interests. In the aftermath of the Beirut blast, France and Turkey are also signaling their own desire to get more involved. French President Emmanuel Macron wasted no time. He immediately came over to visit the blast site in Beirut and show solidarity with the Lebanese people. Some would say he arrived almost as an imperialist leader who came over to give the leaders of Lebanon a telling off. Macron's visit put these leaders in the position of mere guardians of France's regional soft power. The French president vowed to come back again to check what progress had been made. In the meantime, he proposed a number of reforms to get Lebanon back on track. Indeed, if anyone has any interest in maintaining Lebanon as a functional state, it's France. Lebanon, a former French colony, is a host nation for French troops and still serves as France's gateway to the Levant. France is gradually losing its influence in the Mediterranean, especially in North Africa, where Turkish influence is growing ever more visible. Therefore, the geopolitical importance of Lebanon for France is nowadays much more significant. If Lebanon collapses, France cannot guarantee the safety of its troops there. France is also on good terms with Lebanon's Maronite community, which by default serves as a proxy to preserve French interests. For France, the protection of Lebanese Maronites is of utmost importance for its Middle Eastern strategy. Turkey, on the other hand, is well aware of the dangers of getting sucked into a Lebanese quagmire. Perhaps Ankara is a little less optimistic than France is regarding the longevity of the Lebanese state. Ankara is seemingly preparing for the inevitable collapse of Lebanon, and is focusing its interest primarily on people and regions where it could retrieve some kind of benefit. For Turkey, that region is the predominantly Sunni city of Tripoli in northern Lebanon. One initiative has seen Turkey offer citizenship to Sunni Muslims in the Tripoli area who are descendants of Turks. Turkey may be interested in establishing an allied exclave around the city, much like its relationship with the other Tripoli in Libya. This would grant Turkey extra leverage in the Mediterranean, especially if it can establish a military base there. For the time being, it is difficult to say what the future holds for Lebanon, or if Lebanon even has a future at all. The international community is not ready for another Syria-like scenario that will send millions of refugees fleeing on boats towards the European continent. It also cannot allow current forecasts of hundreds of thousands of children in Lebanon potentially facing starvation by the end of the year to become reality. But the truth is, so long as Hezbollah continues to refuse to willingly let go of its stranglehold on Lebanon, and until the Lebanese people themselves unite behind an all-inclusive national leader who will push ahead with much-needed economic and political reforms, these forecasts probably will become reality. This would no doubt lead to war, the outcome of which can be nothing but bad.
And that has been Radio EastMed's roundup of all of the top stories of August 2020. I have been your host, Editor-in-Chief Ertan Karpazli. Thank you for listening, and tune in next month for more updates from the Eastern Mediterranean. Thank you.